Hey everyone, I'd like to take us all on a journey that I went through in my final semester of visual communication at university. Join me as we take flight. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Walamedigal people of the Darug Nation, the traditional owners of the land I'm on. The land I live, eat, work, and play on is the same land that they once lived, ate, worked, and played on, and continue to do so. I would also like to acknowledge Auntie Rhonda, a Gadigal, Darug, and Yuin elder, and Victor Stephenson, a Tagala cultural advisor. And they both had specific voices in my work, influencing the way I approach my project and the eventual outcome. Today, I'd like to explain the project I worked on, my research methodology, the design-led research that developed from that, and how that formed into my vodcast and project, and finally, what I've taken away from this project. So, what was it? Well, we were tasked with presenting our backyard over two vodcasts, or videos. The concept of the backyard was up for interpretation, but we were encouraged to place a local pedagogy on it. The main limitation was that it needed to be local, but we could determine the physical and conceptual boundary of that. I personally chose to focus on my literal backyard, with an eventual focus on the birds that came around my house after the research and the reflections that I had conducted. This was because over time I began to notice that many types of birds seemed to commune at my pool, and so eventually I targeted my research towards that. Now I'd like to start by weaving in a little story from a consultation I had with Tagalog cultural advisor Victor Stephenson. I'd been researching the birds that I saw around my house, and I wanted to understand how to connect with the birds and how to relate to them, more than just observing them. We met over Zoom, given online study, and when I asked him, why is it that the birds fly off when I get close? He replied pretty honestly, and he said, they fly away because they don't trust you. And it's true. At this point, I really didn't have their trust, and just like how I didn't understand the birds at this point, at the beginning of the course I also didn't fully understand how to engage with indigenous people and their ways of thinking and living. Now, for my first vodcast, I really didn't know how to portray the land that I lived on, and so I withdrew to use a method that I knew best, videography. But my lack of experience on land and my lack of connection to the land was pretty clear. Since this vodcast turned into a 2-minute documentary of my literal backyard, I clearly had space to grow, and I actually even acknowledged this at the end of my vodcast. As we learned more about indigenous ways of thinking, one of the texts which played a prominent part in our design work, in shaping the system of methods that we used, was Decolonizing Research, Indigenous Story Workers Methodology, written by Joanne Archibald Kumkum Shiem, Jenny Bolgen Lee Morgan, and Jason DeSantolo. They explained that the principles which underpin indigenous research were summed up in 7 key principles: respect, reciprocity, responsibility, reverence, synergy, holism, and interrelatedness. In my work, I place an emphasis on holism and interrelatedness. So my understanding of holism was that the idea we need to widen our understanding of the things around us, and a large part of my project was focused on learning more about the birds and how to interact with them. Interconnectedness played a role in creating connections between all the variables and findings that I came across in my research, and this focus was what underpinned my research and my outcome. Now, having heard this from Victor, I was a little taken aback. Surely I had some sort of affinity with the birds. I'd been seeing them so much over the past few months. But no, he told me, they were probably there because of the pool, a body of water. But if I simply put in the effort to reach out to the birds and to feed them occasionally, Victor told me, they'll learn to trust you very quickly. Now, according to the Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property Charter, ICIP, Indigenous people retain the rights to their heritage and culture. This includes all manner of cultural practices, traditional knowledge, and their resources or knowledge systems. They have the right to use these, but more often than not, Indigenous art, culture, and language has been misused and appropriated on products and brands for commercial gain, especially in the tourism sector. Self-determination is the notion that Indigenous people should retain the rights to this knowledge, culture, art, and so on, and in doing so, determine their own ways of life. My project aimed to action this notion, not by telling their story, since it isn't my story to tell, but was to approach this work through the Indigenous story work principles that we mentioned earlier, and to constantly seek the guidance and counsel of cultural advisors that we were so graciously given access to. In addition to this, decolonizing our research was a key part of this actioning of Indigenous self-determination. Now, as we continued our consultation, Victor explained to me how he would often try to connect with the animals around his home. He told me a story about a family of kangaroos in his backyard, and he encouraged me to try the same with the birds, saying, get to know a bird, and it'll fly right through your window. A research method I used for my work was futuring. This method is a design method inherent to Western ways of thinking. Essentially, I decided on two different variables which I placed on a scale. Each future relied on the extremes of either variable, which I would alter the outcomes I featured. These variables were construction and care. One of the ways I tried to decolonize it was by conducting with and around the birds as I tried to connect with them. Seeing how difficult it was for me, being so inexperienced with connecting to the birds, the potential futures I came up with were influenced by this. It's also important to note that in my futures, my consultation with Victor also decolonized my understanding of the birds, and that also influenced the results I came up with. As for what futures I came up with, I had 4 futures. Environmental destruction, the result of more buildings and less care for the environment. Artificial wildlife, a future where more and more buildings would reduce the natural landscape to a few wildlife reserves. Return to roots, where society eventually realizes that they need to peel back the buildings and care for the environment. And finally, the land fights back, where the overextension of industry results in the complete destruction of cities and nature takes back its place. The other method I used was mapping. Mapping, again, is an inherently Western approach to research, which I attempted to decolonize by conducting it on land. Had I conducted this research from afar, it would have been a completely colonized approach. Again, Victor's consultation gave me a better understanding for the results that I gained from this work, and it helped me to view it in a decolonized way. Mapping was essentially a way for me to visualize my home and the surrounding land around my home. I wanted to find out where the birds often stopped and where they would stop in particular parts of my home, why they did that as well. After watching and speaking to Victor about my results, it was clear to both of us that the birds enjoyed stopping by because of the body of water that my pool offered them. This corroborated with what I had noticed when I was mapping, that the birds would often play in the water and would stay by the side of the pool. Unlike my first vodcast, the second vodcast placed a lot more emphasis on understanding the land and the birds, and it really reflected how over the course of this project I had learned more about the understanding and decolonizing my way of thinking and working. This time, I began by reflecting on the community of birds around my home, and how that made me think about the lack of community I had during lockdown. I reflected on why the birds came by, and imagined the possibilities of a future. A world where the birds were not cared for, but also a hope that one day we would work together to care for the birds. At the end of the vodcast, I drew the connection between reaching out to the birds and reaching out to our loved ones. There was a similar love and care that was required. Now, at the end of our session together, Victor had explained his own experiences with me, and I thanked him for our time together. A spontaneous idea popped into my head. Just like how we needed to show love and care to the birds, we also need to show a similar love and care to our family, our friends, and our loved ones. When he heard this, Victor smiled and said, "See, now you're starting to get it." So, what was this all about? Well, ultimately, it was an opportunity for us to expand our way of thinking, to decolonize our Western views, and to learn the indigenous way of thinking. Through practices such as deep listening and seeking the wisdom of cultural advisors, we learned more about the land around us and how to connect with it. At the end of the day, our projects were simply finite outcomes, but they marked moments in our learning, the moments in which we learned more about ourselves and the land we live on. This is a learning which will last a lifetime. Thank you.